One thing I wrote in How the Other Half Dies, don't study the poor, study the rich, and not the poor, because the poor already know what's wrong with their lives. And if you want to help them, the best thing you can do is to give them an idea of how their oppressors are operating and what are the techniques that they are using. And you are maybe a victim, but of what are you a victim? This is what you can help people to understand.
Hello, my name is Sean Macheza, and you're listening to History in Action, 50 Years of Activism and Ideas, a counter-history by the Transnational Institute. Over the course of 5 episodes, we'll cover some of the major moments that have shaped the international left over the last 50 years. It's a story of ideas, movements, and personalities that have shaped the world today. It's a story of the rise of new forms of capitalism and authoritarianism. It's also the story of a global progressive think tank, the Transnational Institute, or TNI. And above all, it's a story of resistance. You just heard from Susan George, TNI's honorary president, who's been involved with TNI since 1974. In this first episode, we'll hear how some of the struggles of the 1970s were forged in resistance to the US war in Vietnam, the coup in Chile, anti-colonial liberation movements around the world, and new ways of seeing hunger and debt. Join us and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Let us start at the beginning. Peter Weiss, a human rights lawyer and nuclear abolition activist, and Cora Weiss, a feminist and anti-war activist, and one of the national leaders of Women's Strike for Peace. Cora and Peter, along with Susan George, though in different parts of the world, were active in opposing the US war in Vietnam and would be instrumental in setting up the Transnational Institute.
Women's Strike for Peace was formed because of the atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons, of atomic weapons, we called them then. Barry Commoner was a scientist at a university in St. Louis, and he decided that we had to look for the presence of strontium-90 in baby teeth because the U.S. was testing the atmospheric testing of atomic bombs. The bombs would drop on the grass, and the grass would get radiated, and the cows ate the grass, and we gave our babies cow milk. So all the women of Women's Strike for Peace, which was a huge national organization of women, gathered together to send him our baby's teeth. And unfortunately, he came up with evidence that there was, in fact, strontium-90 in some of the teeth. And it freaked us out. But because of that, we then declared war on atmospheric testing of atomic bombs. And we went around the country telling newspaper editors about this story and begging them to write about it. And that created an educated public opinion, so that in October of 1962 or 3, we went to the White House to stand at the fence while Kennedy was signing the treaty to ban the atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons. And Kennedy's science advisor, Jerome Wiesner, and he said to the president, "Look, Mr. President, who is standing at the gate, sort of witnessing this momentous occasion of your signing a treaty to ban the atmospheric testing of atomic bombs." And Jack Kennedy was so happy that he called his wife, Jackie, and said, "Take those women coffee and donuts." And she did. And that was his response, his recognition of the role of civil society, of women in civil society. And that was very important, because without mobilized civil society, we don't get change. Barry Commoner was key. And that turned us all into anti-nuclear activists. So I came first, and then Peter saw how successful we were. He became the international legal expert on the illegality of nuclear weapons. We had a meeting of Women's Strike for Peace, which was dedicated at that time to the banning of atomic bombs. And we became an anti-war, wonderful women's organization. And that changed my life. I was devoted to ending the war in Vietnam and doing a lot of unique things with prisoners of war and challenging the government and so forth.
The Vietnam War had started, and I had a very bad feeling about this. And when in 1967 some really heavy bombardments and terrible massacres were being reported and so on, I wanted to be involved in doing something about it, but I had no idea what to do. So what do? I write to Noam Chomsky out of the blue because he had published things in the New York Review and so on. And very kindly, this man answers and says, there's a group of Americans in Paris against the war, and here's how you get in touch with them.
Another group of Americans would soon head to Paris, including former White House staffer Marcus Raskin and State Department lawyer Richard Barnett. They had joined the Kennedy administration with hopes of systemic transformation, but became disillusioned and founded the Washington, D.C.-based Institute for Policy Studies, or IPS. Here's John Kavanagh, a TNI associate who was the director of the IPS from 1999 to 2021. He has also worked as an international economist for the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development and for the World Health Organization.
It was started in 1963 by two people who left the Kennedy administration, feeling that there could never be solutions to the key issues of the day. And the biggest issue at that time was nuclear disarmament. But they concluded in government that the people in government would never abolish nuclear weapons. Too much influence from the corporations that produce them, from the generals. And they concluded that it would only be powerful social movements from the outside, armed with good ideas, good research, that could change it. The term they used for the niche we would fill was public scholarship. So people who did good research, writing, communications, but linked to social movements. It would be the power of social movements that could stand up against the power of corporations and the power of governments. And by the early 70s, two things catalyzed the creation of TNI. One was people at IPS realizing that almost everything we were fighting were global issues, from the environment to nuclear disarmament and war to inequality.
The IPS was under FBI surveillance. The political atmosphere in the United States was deteriorating. The people behind the Institute for Policy Studies went in search of a second home for the IPS to ensure it would endure in case something happened in the United States. They found a wonderful ally in Samuel Rubin, father of Cora Weiss. Rubin's philanthropy and vision made the difference between TNI as an idea and TNI as fact.
My father fell in love with Mark and Dick and IPS and what they were trying to do. And the idea that Peter is very key on is that they had to internationalize because their thinking was too devoted to the national issues and that they had a lot to learn from people in what was then called the Third World. The two things we were really concerned about was getting rid of colonialism, which we worked very hard on, and supporting the anti-colonial leaders in Africa. We were very close to many of them. And getting rid of nuclear weapons was key, very important. and putting women at the decision-making tables was very important. So those were our issues. And of course, we didn't like all of the corporations. I don't think we behaved or we became active in becoming anti-capitalist. We just believed in it.
I I had a strong feeling that the United States should not be telling the rest of the world what should be done. And we had a lot to learn from other countries.
TNI represented a multilateral or multinational think tank based on the views of people especially from the so-called developing world. And we had to internationalize our thinking and doing. And that was why they decided to create TNI.
I started out as an organizer, and I knew the people in Washington who were setting up TNI, and I organized a dinner for them in Paris because they wanted to meet French intellectuals. Their mission was to go to Europe and see where could they set up an institute outside of the United States. And this is during the Vietnam War. It's in 1972, and they are thinking they had to have a point of view from outside and of people who were not Americans, and they had to have that point of view on the United States. That was the primary motivation for TNI. So their largest donor and the two directors came to Europe and were going different places. And we settled finally in Amsterdam because there was a building there that somebody gave us, which was a very good reason, a lovely building in Paulus-Potterstraat. And so that's where the first TNI was set up. And we had some fellows that were named by the first director, Iqbal Ahmad.
Iqbal was not only brilliant and creative and risk-taking and engaging people who didn't have a voice anywhere, but Iqbal was also an incredible cook. So he was not only a brilliant intellectual and thinker, but he was a great cook. Nice combination.
And so, in 1973, with Reuben Raskin and Barnett's support, Iqbal Ahmad, a Pakistani journalist, professor, and dedicated revolutionary, set off on a 5-week trip across Europe to consult about the idea of the Transnational Institute. He spoke with over 200 people representing a wide political and intellectual spectrum. And on 9 November, he arrived as TNI's first director to an empty building opposite the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam, given to TNI by philanthropist Ed Jens. Soon, he had turned TNI into an intellectual hub, bursting with activity.
I don't want to take your time with introducing the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam. As the months pass, and hopefully as the years pass, I hope that our work itself would introduce the Institute to you. We have come to Amsterdam with some hopes, many aspirations, and very few plans. Very few plans because we feel that we should ultimately be guided by the needs of the people in Europe, in the third world particularly, and in the United States. What those needs are, I think it's for you to define. We are an academic, educational institution, but we are also hopefully a progressive, committed one, committed to social justice, to freedom, to equality, and to the construction of new societies, socialist societies across the world. He decided to begin a small, modest effort in Europe because we felt that while the multinational corporations have created organic linkages and relationships across the nations with various elites between the metropolitan countries and the elites of the countries in the third world, while the imperialist forces have been able to create both relationships, linkages and institutions of a transnational nature, contacts between people committed to social justice, to progressive movements, have been relatively unstructured. And of course we are not going to structure them, but a small effort at creating an institution that will be both progressive and transnational in nature would be helpful.
Here's Bhaskar Vashi, TNI's third director, remembering Ahmad and his contribution after he passed away in 1999.
He taught all of us about what our relations should be about the third world. He taught us humility, he taught us wisdom, and he taught us a great deal more. And his view, when he was director of the Institute, was that we should take on the big power structures of the world, as Sam Rubin had articulated. And as a result, he created an atmosphere where an anti-corporate ethos could develop. And therefore, he developed an anti-corporate research capacity in CIS, the Counter-Information Services, SOMA, which was a research organization in Holland, and in the anti-apartheid movement in Holland as well. And together, we produced a great deal of reports that challenged the power of the multinationals. But he also went beyond that. He felt that the Institute should not stop at attacking the power structures, but also create alternatives to those power structures. And as a result, we had intense discussions and an atmosphere where the experiments that were going on throughout the world, in Vietnam, in China, in Africa, etc., that could be looked upon as inspirations for a new society. And it was that sort of ethos that he inculcated in us, that you just don't attack the power structure, but you also try and create alternatives to those structures.
From 1974 to 75, Iqbal assembled the leading revolutionary thinkers from the global north and south. He forged a brilliant fellowship, including Fred Halliday, John Berger, Salman Rushdie, and Susan George.
We were being hounded by the FBI, by the Nixon administration. We thought we could be shut down. And so part of the impetus for TNI was to look around the world and see where was free speech protected for the longest. And that's where we found the Netherlands and Amsterdam. And so both of those came together along with a brilliant, wealthy philanthropist named Sam Rubin, who was a socialist but an internationalist. We created the Transnational Institute as the international arm of IPS, but also as a place we could retreat to, and also rooted in this notion of public scholarship. The one difference in its mission was from the very start, people saw at that time, the 1970s, the rise of third worldism, the proposals for a new international economic order, the issues of North and South, the division between North and South, a need for a space where you could bring together the best people, public scholars from rich and poor countries, and focus on these issues. So it had that as its original mandate, which was unique at that time and a beautiful sort of thing. And TNI flourished in the beginning in part because the people who led it at the start were brilliant internationalists. Iqbal Ahmad, Orlando Letelier, Saul Landau, then Bhaskar Vashi. These were people who not only understood the issues, but they were very good. People loved them. So people wanted to come to meetings with them. And so TNI from the start was a fascinating place that people were drawn to. And keep in mind, this is a time when movements, social movements were not that global. There was international connections, but some of them were bad. We were still in the Cold War. So, for example, global unions got together, but they were getting together to fight good things that were happening. The environmental movement was still tiny. The women's movement was small. It had some links, but they weren't big. And so there was not yet, now there was a huge connection between anti-colonial movements around the world. That was strong, particularly in Africa and Asia. But there wasn't a space where the public intellectuals, the public scholars got together, and T&I became that. So it filled a really important void.
I have a special affection and gratitude for the Transnational Institute, with whom I worked for 10 years, and in the context of which we discussed, debated, agreed, often disagreed, on the events of the world from the mid-70s through the 80s and on. When the idea was first broached to the rather staid elements of the British left, who first heard it, I think, including myself in the mid-70s, we thought, this is a crazy idea. How can you have an institute that spans so many parts of the world? How can you have an institute that tries to marry the radical culture of America to that of Europe, let alone to that of the Third World? It was mad, in some ways it is mad, but it has worked. And I think it's that working which is unique. There's no institution in the world which has combined in such an original, creative, non-sectarian way different radical and alternative traditions around the world, has given encouragement to so many younger scholars.
That was Fred Halliday, a former professor of international relations at the London School of Economics and a T&I fellow from 1973 to 1985, speaking at T&I's 25th anniversary in 1999. Indeed, T&I quickly became an idea that worked, but it also quickly became buffeted by the global headwinds it sought to analyze and critique.
Right after this first meeting, the coup against Salvador Allende took place in September of 1973. And so we decided to have a Chile conference. And at that point in my own life in Paris, I was trying to help Chilean refugees to get their papers and taking them to the aliens office, that sort of thing, because they were quite at sea, and there were some ministers there, even ex-ministers, who had fled. And quite a few Chileans were turning up in Paris from different left parties, because if they had stayed, they would have been sent to Dawson Island, or worse, they would have just been disappeared. So I knew these people, and I was able to help set up the Chile conference, which took place in February of 1974.
Meanwhile, in Chile, a former member of Allende's government, the highest ranking to be arrested by Pinochet's goons during the coup, would soon be released. He had worked as the Chilean ambassador to the United States and as Chile's foreign minister. Orlando Letelier would become T&I's second director. His tenure would be tragically brief. The BBC spoke to him when he was imprisoned on Dawson Island in 1973.
35 members of President Allende's government and party organization have been interned here since the coup.
We have several doctors, several lawyers, several engineers here, economists and so on.
So what are your hopes for the next period of time?
Have lawyers and to go to trial and to clarify our legal situation. But what we really want is to have those trials started in order, because we are absolutely convinced that we have not done anything against the law of our country.
John Berger, the acclaimed art critic and novelist and a T&I fellow, became friends with Letelier during their time at T&I. Here he is in his film called About Time, describing Letelier.
I had a friend, a Chilean, Orlando Letelier. He liked music. He was very witty, debonair, and he had extraordinary courage. He was a minister in Allende's government. And when Allende was murdered and the government fell, Orlando was arrested. Then he was put in prison and tortured. And after quite a long while, he was released, but of course had to leave Chile.
Isabel Letelier, a fellow of IPS and TNI and widow to Orlando, recalls how they left Chile for Washington.
The Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C. invited Orlando when he was in prison to come and be a fellow. So he came, and then when I was able to leave the country, I came also. And I learned about the Institute, and I learned about this idea that Sam Rubin has of having a place in Europe where people from the first world could meet with people in the third world. And I thought that was awesome. That was absolutely what we needed in this planet. And to my surprise, Orlando was appointed director of the TNI. So he had to go to Holland as soon as he arrived in the States. And then I realized that Sam Rubin's idea had taken place and was really happening. And everything was incredible.
When Letelier came to the Institute in September 1976, there were two things about him which greatly impressed me. One was that here was a man with a very distinguished past. He had been a Minister of Defense, he had been a Minister of Foreign Affairs, he had been an ambassador to Washington, a director of the Inter-American Bank, and yet in that institute, he treated everybody the same. Everybody he listened to, everybody he treated the same. The second quality he had, and coming from, if I may say so, a European left that was always full of complaint and whinging and fetching and moaning and I don't know what else, here was a man who had seen his whole life's work destroyed by a fascist group. He was a man who'd been in prison, who'd been tortured, who'd seen his comrades killed, and yet he was full of life. He was full of enthusiasm. He was never complained. He was playing the guitar in the evening. He had a joie de vivre, despite or because of these things.
So probably at the beginning of September, there was a fellows' meeting in Amsterdam, which Orlando came as our new director. And I'd got the train from Amsterdam to Paris. I now have, for the first time in my life, I have a director. He's supporting my project, and I'm now writing my Vietnam project for somebody I believe in, for a director. And then I went out to the nearby square and bought the International Herald Tribune, the English language newspaper that you could buy in Paris. And then on the front page was Letelier, Orlando was assassinated.
When the assassination happened, that weekend there was an extraordinary outpouring on the streets of Washington, a demonstration in his honor, very political. Suddenly there were thousands and thousands of people on the street. I ended up walking with Izzy Stone, I.F. Stone, but I saw all of these people in Washington. Joan Baez came to sing. It was this combination between a kind of leftist cultural milieu and a leftist political milieu, and politicians and academics and independent writers. It was really a beautiful time. It was a wonderful time. And then this tragedy happened, and everyone was really just devastated. We were devastated, and also Ronnie Moffat, who was just married. I had seen her the day before this thing happened. It was really traumatic.
You've just heard the voices of Anthony Barnett, writer, founder of Open Democracy and associate of TNI, and Susan Bark-Morse, who worked at TNI in the 1970s. On 21 September 1976, just 6 months after his appointment as the director of the Transnational Institute, Orlando Letelier was murdered in Washington, D.C. A bomb was placed in a car he was traveling in, killing him and a young APS staffer named Ronnie Moffat.
He traveled around the world, talking about the fate of his country. And he persuaded certain governments to reduce or to stop trade with Chile, up to the point when Pinochet decided that he should be got rid of.
It would take years of dedicated work, but ultimately, the family and friends of Letelier, and the staff of IPS in particular, succeeded in tying the events of that terrible day back to Pinochet, as documented in Assassination on Embassy Row, a book by John Dinges and Saul Landau. The international solidarity spurred by his life and by his death would endure.
The solidarity that Chileans received from the Dutch people it still amazes me. When I arrived for the first time in Amsterdam, I was introduced to the group that was in charge of the solidarity by a young man called Jan-Jos Tunisen, and his wife Afke interviewed me, and she had interviewed Orlando before. They had met Orlando. And one of the reasons why Orlando Letelier was deprived of his nationality is, according to the Chilean government, is because he stopped a loan that the Dutch people, the Dutch government was going to give to Pinochet. So that was the reason why. But in fact, it was the unions in Holland, the one that opposed to that pact. So Jan Jost introduced me to the Solidarity movement. It was the first 11th of September that I spent in Amsterdam. I couldn't believe it. When the whole party that was in power, the Denauw party, that saw this gathering of people, huge gathering, where was headed, there's a march headed by people from the government, ministers, and then the leaders of the unions, and the person of the house of Anna Frank, and all the human rights organizations, and the churches, and huge amount of public that were willing to march for my country. I was crying. I was crying the whole evening. It started in the afternoon, and in the evening I was still crying because it was so moving. The seriousness, though, and it happened every single year. Mrs. Allende would head the march many times, and a couple of times when she couldn't be there, I was there. Those images of the solidarity of the Dutch people are unforgettable.
I heard the news of this assassination one night, and early next morning, Eve, my son, was born. Orlando dead, Eve born. Anyway, it seems to me this poem is part of the story. Once I will visit you, he said, in your mountains. Today, assassinated, blown to pieces, he has come to stay. He lived in many places, and he died everywhere. In this room, he has come between the pages of open books. There's not a single apple on the trees loaded with fruit this year which he has not counted. Apples the color of gifts. He faces death no more. There's not a precipice over which his corpse has not been hurled. The silence of his voice, tidy and sweet as the leaf of a beech, will be safe in the forest. I never heard him speak in his mother tongue, except when he named the names of patriots. The clouds race over the grass faster than sheep. Never lost, he consulted the compass of his heart, always accurate. Took bearings from the needle of Chile and the eye of Santiago, through which he has now passed. Before the fortress of injustice, he brought many together with the delicacy of reason, and spoke there of what must be done amongst the rocks, not by giants, but by women and men. They blew him to pieces because he was too coherent. They made the bomb because he was too fastidious. And what his assassins whispered to themselves, his voice could never have said. Afraid of his belief in history, they chose the day of his murder. He has come as the season turns, at the moment of the blood-red rowanberry. He endured the time without seasons which belongs to the torturers. He will be here too, in the spring, every spring, until the seasons returning explode in Santiago.
Back in Amsterdam, a new director would start his tenure at TNI. Under the directorship of Bhaskar Vashi, a Zimbabwean trained at the London School of Economics, TNI became the place in Europe for African liberation movements to meet. Bhaskar played a key role in the Zimbabwe National Liberation Movement and participated in the Lancaster House talks, which resulted in the first democratic elections of an independent Zimbabwe in 1980.
And the first thing I did was, of course, to more or less go back home. That I began establishing contacts with the Southern African liberation movements because I felt that the Institute would and should support the liberation of Southern Africa. As a result, contacts was established by the ANC, ZAPU, ZANU, FRELIMO, MPLA, SWAPO, all the movements in Southern Africa. And we got very intense discussions with the liberation movements and began talking about an alternative society that could have been possible in that region. And what was important to us was that we began an education process with the liberation movements to create an alternative vision of a society.
I was involved in Zimbabwe politics, which meant being secretary of the Zimbabwe African People's Union, which is a nationalist organization based in Zimbabwe. Actually, just keeping people together, Zimbabweans who were living in London, living through a very miserable time because they wanted to be back home. But it also meant that I could travel back to Lusaka, which is where the headquarters of our movement was, because we were involved in what they called the armed struggle at the time. And that required a lot of organization, and went back to Lusaka to more or less volunteer to join the movement. I was also taken to the camps, which is where the guerrillas were being trained, etc. I remember one terrifying experience was I was sent to Solwezi, which was between the border of the Congo Republic and Zambia. And there were hundreds and thousands of these kids who had left Zimbabwe to become fighters, basically. They just lived in the forest. And the Smith regime, for some reason, decided to bomb this place. And you had these bombs falling and trees splitting. And all these children were thrown in the air with blood and flesh and all of these things falling on top of you. It was the most dramatic experience I had. I wasn't very good at military struggle. And they wanted somebody in Europe to be a representative of ZAPU. So I was sent to London again as a diplomat.
Bhaskar was a very, I'd say, an elegant person. A lot of stature, considered in his thinking and speaking. Pretty calm, quite calm. But especially you felt like you were speaking with someone with a lot of honor.
That was Ariane van Buren, TNI's first woman director, who succeeded Vashi in 1985. Vashi would remain involved in TNI as a friend and thinker until he passed away in 2005. During his time as director, TNI's scope of work expanded from Chile to food, agribusiness, debt, and the so-called New International Economic Order.
The vision was simply that the rules had been set up to completely favor the richer industrialized countries. So the main proposals were for OPEC-like agreements on the whole range of commodities that would allow developing countries to raise, stabilize, get more resources, and something called a common fund, which would pool funds together both from the commodity riches, but also from rich countries that would help, again, pull up the global south. But it was killed by the U.S. hated it. Henry Kissinger, here was Henry Kissinger intervening in Chile and all over the place. He also went into the UN and put a kibosh on that, killed that by the late 70s. And so it was dwindling. And of course, then 1980, 81, you have those elections of the neoliberal people, and you have the World Bank and IMF emerging as the dominant institutions to impose structural adjustment. I think the key thing for TNI at this point and IPS was we realized there needs to be a massive fight back against this, and it's going to have to come from below.
The World Food Conference in 1974 was a huge effort on the part of FAO to respond to the food crisis in the Sahel, because the newspapers and the media had been full of starving babies, of this terrible Holocaust that was taking place in the Sahel in Africa. And so FAO was responding. And what I had basically was a course from 2 former Chilean ministers and 3 Brazilians who had a Latin American point of view necessarily, but who were also fully aware of the United States politics as far as food was concerned, and of agribusiness. And this is what they concentrated on. And whereas the FAO and the whole majority view was population, people, there's too many babies, they're all eating, they're all wanting to eat. But nobody paid any attention to the fact that small farmers were being removed from their land with often military means, that there were great, huge business corporations which were taking over vast tracts. Agribusiness was. And so I was learning things as we went along. And when at the conference, what I witnessed was that the biggest delegation there was the United States, and equal to that was the agribusiness delegation. Very interesting. And the FAO had a program which was called the Industry Cooperative Program, which was there to cooperate with agribusiness. And there was a young American who was also doing the dog's body type work. And when we left this conference, I said, we can't leave things in this state. And we thought we've got to do something more truthful about what the world food situation really is. And he said, yes, and let's do it. So I thought, okay, we can do this together. And I worked for about 6 or 7 months on doing research about agribusiness, about population, about what were the real problems, about the Green Revolution, various subjects of this kind, and what was the American policy on food aid and what was that doing. So I went to see somebody at the French Institute of Agronomy whom I'd met at the food conference, and I said, look, here's the situation. I think I've got enough for a couple of chapters, or at least for an introduction and a conclusion. Will you do a chapter? And he said, no, but why don't you just do it since you've already started, and I'll help you if you need it. So that's what I did, and that was How the Other Half Dies, which I sent via a friend and sold it to Penguins. Penguins took it, and the rest has been my life ever since 1975. And it is still, when I go to India, for instance, people still say, I read your book. I worked on food issues for a good 10 years, refining the analysis, writing other things like Feeding the Few, that was published by IPS, and I kept working on these issues. But the World Food Assembly, which was a group of about 100 people, 50 from the South, 50 from the North, roughly. So the World Food Assembly meets. All of the people from the South say, look, Susan, there's one new big factor in hunger. That is debt. You've got to write about debt because this is the big new factor in hunger. It is causing huge ravages. Structural adjustment is a disaster. Small farmers are losing their land. It's getting much, much worse. And you have to write about it. And I said, I can't. I'm not an economist. I don't know about financial issues. And they said, no, you've got to do it because you've got a reputation and we will help you. So that's how I got started on debt. And what was new about this was the power of the World Bank and the IMF to impose what were called structural adjustment programs, but which were out and out austerity. They were get rid of your public services, privatize everything in sight, make it much more difficult for people to get an education and health care, and produce things for the market, because the market is not interested, and the financial market is not interested in your pesos, your shillings, your rupees, your whatever. And so you better get out there and earn some hard cash so that you can pay them in dollars or European currencies or whatever. And that was the problem. And so it was necessary when the crunch came and they had taken out loans which were at the time at very low interest rates, sometimes even negative interest rates, because there was lots of inflation in the world at the time. And suddenly in the United States, Paul Volcker puts the interest rate up to an astronomical level, and they start having to pay 8, 9, 10% a year. They can't find it. So right away in '82, the crunch comes with Mexico, which just looks in the cash drawer one day and there's nothing there, and they say, sorry fellows, we've got a payment due on Monday and we're not going to pay it because there ain't no money. And that was the opening up of the crisis, and then it spread. And
in the context of the sprawling debt crisis, the new international economic order emerged as a set of proposals advocated by countries of the global south to end economic colonialism and dependency through a new interdependent economy.
So in that amazing decade of the 1970s, where third world countries came together, formed different spaces of connection, they formed a UN agency that would be the intellectual home of the proposals for a new international economic order. Those were proposals that would give more power to developing countries, to form the sort of OPEC-like agreements to try to pull together coffee producers, sugar producers, raise and stabilize the price of those commodities, give more power, create financial funds that give more power, and then address this imbalance between North and South, that key founding issue of TNI. I came into that work and went to work at the UN Conference on Trade and Development. I, like many young people in the United States, was pulled in to the Vietnam War opposition. But for me, the interesting thing was less for the fight against the US government. It was I was entranced meeting people from Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia who were part of this movement. And I became very interested in what their visions were for their countries. So I was with a lot of the great people who were putting together the proposals to try to change the rules of the global economy. Now, part of why I think I was attracted to TNI was I saw, even at that age, but as many did, a fundamental flaw in all these proposals. This was a very top-down set of proposals. It was how can third world governments get together to get more, but to get more for them. It wasn't to get more for their workers or their communities or their farmers. It was if you will, an elitist project. It was a terrific one for what it was trying to do. It raised a key issue, but many of the people pushing it were third world autocrats who were not with their people. And one of the pieces of work I did at UNCTAD that completely changed my life and the way I think about things was looking at, if you look, we broke down what we called the banana dollar. If you took a dollar you bought 3 bananas for $1, who got what? And we analyzed that 89% of it went to Chiquita and United Brands, and the big banana companies won. And then of the 11% that went to Honduras, only 2% of that was going to the workers. So if that is your understanding, if you take the project as the new international economic order and you raise and stabilize the price of bananas, most it's not going to trickle down to the workers. So the sensibility that I think many of us brought into TNI who worked on those issues was, yes, we need more equity between rich countries and poor countries, but if it is not done with a bottom-up impetus, with the movements that would actually benefit the people, it won't benefit the people. So I was at UNCTAD, early 80s. Ronald Reagan was elected. Ronald Reagan, with instructions from the Heritage Foundation, the same group that is giving instructions to Donald Trump right now, they investigated U.S. involvement in the UN. The key issue in the 80s for the right was the free market. So they looked and said, which UN agencies are interfering in the free market? One of them was UNCTAD. And so the work I was doing was shut down. And all of a sudden, I needed to find a new place to go. Two things brought me to TNI. One was that in college, I had read a brilliant book by one of the co-founders of IPS, Richard Barnett, called Global Reach, one of the first big books on multinational corporations. Brilliant book. So I knew there was this place called IPS. I had this long-term dream to go to IPS and write a sequel with Richard Barnett, which amazingly I was able to do. But the connector was a wonderful Brazilian in Geneva who had been tortured under the dictatorship in Brazil, then went to the World Council of Churches in Geneva and became one of my best friends while I was working at the UN. His name was Marcos Arruda. And when he heard I was being booted out of the UN, he said, Transnational Institute, he'd already been connected partly through Richard Barnett and IPS. And so I flew. So I first went to TNI before IPS. He introduced me to the folks there, to Basker and others. I went and met them and thought, these people are incredible. I loved TNI. I then go on to IPS. And at IPS, the new International Economic Order project that Orlando had started had then been run by one of the survivors of that assassination of Orlando, Michael Moffat. And at this time, he was thinking he needed to move on and go and move away. So all of a sudden, this is where timing is everything. I walk in and they say, oh, we're looking for someone to run this global economy, new international economic order project. You seem great. Took about 10 minutes and they hired me. But the key issue for me, it was that TNI was in the middle of this fascinating global conversation about what should be the rules of the global economy. And this was at the moment Reagan had taken over the US, Thatcher in England, Helmut Kohl in Germany, free marketeers, if you will. They weren't really free marketeers. They wanted rules that favored corporations. So they were very interventionist.
Free market fundamentalism was not a new idea. As Naomi Klein describes in her work, Pinochet's Chile was a testing lab for these ideas. In Thatcher and Reagan, they would come to reshape the world for the worse. In these events that unfolded in the early days of TNI, a new ideology took shape. It would impoverish parts of the global north, decimate lives and livelihoods across the global south, and skew our collective understanding of the world to the point that many people still do not believe climate change is real. Enter neoliberalism.
It seemed to me that it was time to examine what's the ideological basis for all of this, because it was clear that the policies don't work. If by working we mean doing any good for emancipation of human beings and doing any good for what I would call development, which is education for everybody, healthcare for everybody, and so on. I don't have to define that. You know what I'm talking about. And developing your own industry so that it is, you can choose the kinds of activities that you're going to be good at, and you can trade but on your own terms, and so on. This is not the way the world is going at all, as we can all see. And the neoliberals are in control, and perhaps what I was surprised at, although I should not have been surprised, was that after the crisis, this kind of capitalism became more and more entrenched. Not only did they win, but they won big, and they are really dictating policy now throughout the world. It has been a stupendous victory. So that is what I've been following. And I did it first with a book about the World Bank, which I wrote with a colleague called Fabrizio Sabelli. And we treated this ideology as a myth, as a religion, because that's what it is. It is a belief system in which they are wedded to a certain number of basic principles, and there is no way to prove that it works, but you don't need a way to prove that it works. It's faith. So it seemed to me that one had to say, how did this get so powerful? And I discovered that there were really very good practical and pragmatic reasons, and that the neoliberals were much smarter than we on the left, and they were able to take over because they had a lot of money, but they also understood that you had to go to the places where ideas were formulated and disseminated. So they went after the media, they went after the universities, they went after the think tanks, and they started churning out these ideas which they treated as received truths, and they popularized them because they really had a huge infrastructure. It cost them about $1 billion, but that investment was incredibly cheap.
Neoliberalism has reconfigured the world, how it is governed, but also how we think and see our range of possibilities. The creeping capture of democratic institutions continues today as international fora are snatched, co-opted, and compromised. So fossil fuel companies inform climate policy, agribusiness shapes food policy, and arms companies set border and war policies.
How did it happen that we've got corporate capture? It happened through the success of the neoliberal ideology. That's the short answer. The longer answer is through the capture of the places where ideas are manufactured and disseminated. Now, there was real democracy, I think, at least representative democracy, in a good number of countries, but now they are, even inside a given country, citizens have less and less control because the government is really listening to business, and that's that. They're listening to the markets, and if the markets are dissatisfied, they're scared to death. What I'm now trying to sort out is what I'm calling the hegemony of illegitimate authority, because there are all these groups which are informal, or at least started out as informal, which have become officialized, and which are the first spokespeople, the first people governments go to find out what should our policy be in this area, in the environment, what should it be in finance, what should here or there. And so all the laws get watered down, and it really is a crisis of democracy. And unless we react, it's going to be that way for the foreseeable future. And I think people don't understand this because they're told 60 times a day, you have been living beyond your means, and the markets know best, and the markets will always come to the right decision.
The markets most certainly do not come to the right decision. So where do the real answers lie? Many movements and organizations like TNI are working to advance real alternatives today, and as John Kavanagh told us, really always have been.
We very much operated under an adage of this guy, Peter Weiss. Peter always said, if at least 50% of your work is not on alternatives, it's got to be on alternatives. So a huge amount of IPS and TNI's work in the 80s and 90s was about pulling people together from rich and poor countries and working on what would be our alternatives to the World Bank, our alternatives to the IMF, our alternatives to these horrible agreements like the World Trade Organization and the North American Free Trade Agreement. Could you flip the logic on its head? So it's interesting, we weren't anti-globalization. We were for changing the rules that heavily favored corporations to rules that favored workers, the environment, women, small farmers. And some amazing...
Would you call that then what they now call alter globalization?
Yes, alter globalization was a term that we love. And at many TNI and IPS meetings during that period, all the way up through early 2000s, I remember meeting Breed Brennan 2003 at the summit in Cancun, where the World Trade Organization was meeting. And it was in a large teach-in on alternatives to the WTO. And I do think those movements, in great part, delegitimized the global institutions set up after the war, which became twisted by corporations, the World Bank, IMF, the World Trade Organization. They lost an enormous amount of power through this work. So the work of TNI was to delegitimize, to show World Bank says it's for solving poverty. Okay, look at the evidence. And here would be a way to actually set up institutions of global finance that actually would empower people and be from the bottom up. So incredibly, I feel like looking back at TNI's history and just a thread that goes through it all, that is central. And nobody else was doing it as well. In the 90s, other forums emerged, and there were certainly single issue forums. There was Via Campesina that got peasant groups together. There's the International Trade Union Confederation that gets workers together. There were global, at the COP conferences on climate, the environmental movement would get together. But a sort of intellectual thread that links them, and that also brings people together. So TNI has always been a place that had public scholars. And I just want to say, for me, some of the most interesting work of TNI in the 80s was TNI fostered relations with people who were in the Dutch Parliament, the European Parliament, many progressive social democrats, and it linked them with struggles around the world. One of my first interactions with TNI was in the 90s, just watching it in action on a higher scale. TNI organized a delegation, TNI and IPS, European parliamentarian, to the United States to go to Central America. This was so 1980s, remember the Reagan wars against Nicaragua, the Reagan support of brutal dictatorship in El Salvador. And the idea was, could you shake things up in the US debate where we were desperately trying to stop funding for the bad forces? The US was funding the bad forces in Central America. And a delegation was led by a wonderful Dutch parliamentarian who became super close to TNI, named Evelien Herfkens. And she brought a group of European parliamentarians from different countries. She was a key leader of an interparliamentary union of progressive forces. Brought them to the US. We had them meet with their US Congress counterparts that were fighting against the US wars in Central America. Then they go on a delegation to Central America. Then they come back to Washington and report on what they've seen, on the horrors of what US policy is doing there. And then they write a report. Brilliant model. And it was interesting. We spread it in TNI. I had come into TNI with a great deal of experience in the Philippines through work that I'd done with my wife, Robin Broad, who was a Philippine expert. We brought in some of the best Philippine public intellectuals of our time who became great, both of them still associated with TNI, Joel Rocamora and Walden Bello. And we said, can we use this model in the Philippines? Can we get the Philippines at that point, horrible dictator Ferdinand Marcos, martial law? Can we get European parliamentarians to go and visit the Philippines? Yeah, with good information and all. We brought a group of them to TNI. We met with them. We did seminars on the Philippines. We then sent them there. Breed was involved in this. Picha was involved in this. So you've got huge continuity. Walden and Joel were key to it. And then come back, write a report, and try to shake up European and US and World Bank and IMF support for this dictator. So TNI was also operating in the realms of power at a moment totally different than today.
John here is referring to Breed Benin and Picha First, who are still working with TNI today. Another thread that ran through TNI's work from the beginning was resistance to nuclear weapons. Here's Achin Fanaik, a retired professor of international relations and former head of Department of Political Science at the University of Delhi, a lifelong activist for nuclear disarmament and a long-standing TNI associate.
Myself and my journalist colleague, Praful Bidwai, I mention him because we both came into TNI. We set up a kind of movement in India for nuclear disarmament in Bombay, and did, of course, writings on various issues. And it is during the 1980s, from 1982 onwards, that you had a huge anti-nuclear movement in Europe. This was in response to the Pershing and cruise missiles. It was called the END. You had, of course, CND, Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament in England, in Britain, and you had the European nuclear disarmament movement, nuclear-free zone from Poland to Portugal, as it were. Nuclear disarmament was an important preoccupation of TNI during the 80s. It continued, but then took something of a backseat as you had other developments. It was still there. It's still there. It's actually here. In India, Praful and I were known as probably the most significant opponents of nuclear weapons and, of course, of India's nuclear option, keeping the nuclear option open. All the Indian left parties either supported the red bomb of Soviet Union and China, even as they criticized the American bomb or the British bomb or the French bomb. They supported the red bomb. We need the red bomb. They also supported India in 1974 when it had a peaceful nuclear explosion to show it had nuclear capacity. India kept the option open between 1974 and 1998 when India went nuclear under the BJP regime. All the left parties supported keeping the option open. So we had, and myself, we set up a small independent of the political parties trying to generate awareness about that.
Archin told us about the issues preoccupying TNI and many on the international left in the 80s. Nuclear disarmament, development, but also the rumbles of change that were soon to turn into tectonic shifts.
There was a constant concern with the question of capitalist exploitation of the South. Susan George influence is very real. You had people coming in and talking about the Bretton Woods institutions. So that issue of development, or if you like, lack of development in the global South was an enduring theme. That period also saw the beginnings of glasnost perestroika and the kind of changes that were taking place in the communist bloc. And that became also very interesting. Since I was from an non-Maoist, anti-Maoist tradition, we were always saying that there was always a dispute about how do you characterize these countries, whether they are state capitalist or not. I didn't hold to that, but we held to the view that it is in transition, but it's not going in a socialist direction. And unless there is a transformation there, it's not going to go in that direction. So we were, to begin with, quite excited about what was happening there and hoping that this is going to move in the direction of a much more democratic conception of socialism and so on. As things developed, a number of us got a bit nervous and worried because it wasn't like the early upsurges that had taken place in 1953 in Poland, in 1956 in Hungary, when you had workers' councils and really workers' movements from upsurge. And 1968 was very important because I was in Poland at that time for 3 months. My parents were there. What I found in Poland was that young people there were very critical of the domination by the Soviet Union of Poland. But they saw themselves as socialists. We don't want this domination here, but we are not capitalists. Look at what they're doing in Vietnam, this, that, etc. In fact, you had what is called the children of the nomenklatura. The nomenklatura was the ruling bureaucracy in the Soviet Union. Their children would come to Poland and we meet them and they tell us, Poland is much freer than the Soviet Union. We feel like we're in Paris. We can move around. Wow. My parents and I, we took a road trip in the summer of 1968 to Austria and Germany. And we were to come back to Czechoslovakia and then come to Poland. And the invasion happened one day before we were coming into Czechoslovakia. And you had all kinds of cars and vehicles moving out of Czechoslovakia elsewhere. And ours was the only, my father had a diplomatic car with a diplomatic license, a Polish diplomatic license. We were the only car going into Czechoslovakia. And we saw the hostility. We were staying one night in a hotel over there, and we saw the hostility they were. And they were looking at us. My father had a turban, and the car had a Polish license, and Polish troops had participated, along with Russian troops, in the invasion of Czechoslovakia. But we are not looking Polish. So they were a bit hesitant as to what to make of us. And then I resolved the problem and they became, because I saw them wearing the flag on the Czech flag as a sense of solidarity opposition. So I immediately out the window, I said, please give me that flag and all that. And then they realized we're in solidarity with them. And then that was okay, and we wore that flag there. And then the next day we went. But I was really shocked and angry at what was happening over there. So that was the background of what was taking place.
The winds of change brought about great promises, as well as the unnerving dominance of an ideological system with business and profit at its heart.
I think that when the USSR fell, it proved Margaret Thatcher right for just a few years. And it proved that her infamous TINA phrase, that there is no alternative, and that is, the acronym is TINA, that's how she used to say it, and that there is no alternative to neoliberal capitalism. She was, and Ronald Reagan, they were of course proven right, but just for a few years. That was in 1991. But again, in 1994, the Zapatistas rose with a roaring slogan that we need a world where many worlds fit, in contesting exactly the TINA of Margaret Thatcher. And then in 2001, we celebrated the first social forum in Porto Alegre, and the social forum had, of course, the motto, "Another world is possible."
In the next episode, we look at the world after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the advent of a new breed of deeply damaging trade, and the unstoppable rise of new forms of resistance. You've been listening to History in Action, 50 Years of Activism and Ideas, a 5-part mini-series by the Transnational Institute on its 50th anniversary. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can discover more about the Transnational Institute at tni.org. Please consider supporting our vital ongoing work at tni.org/donate. Interviews for this podcast were conducted by Sean Macheza, Daria Goshenina, and Dennis Burke, with archival interviews by Eric Helmans, Fiona Dove, George Arbon, and Breed Burnett. This series is edited and produced by the Transnational Institute. Thanks to Eden Raskin, Susan Buckmorse, Anthony Burnett, Fiona Dove, Eric Helmans, and the International Institute for Social History. This episode is dedicated to the memory of Ronnie Moffat and Orlando Letelier.